I'm Skylar Steinke here with the Alt Funds Network podcast, and today we have Derek Osgood, who is the CEO and co-founder of Double O, a agentic process automation platform that helps make the process super simple for non-developers and to automate complex processing using teams of agents. Derek, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Excited to chat.
Absolutely. I know we'll get into a bunch of kind of nuances with AI being all the rage, but I'd love to hear kind of maybe just as a starting point, your background, how you got into the space, where you started, and kind of how you developed your expertise over time, and kind of take us to where we're at today.
Yeah, absolutely. My background, I've always been in tech for most of my career. So I started my career actually in gaming at PlayStation, launching big AAA games, and then I've been around venture-backed startups basically ever since then. So did a lot of early stage stuff in fintech, as well as some mobile, and ran kind of like product and marketing teams throughout a bunch of early stage startups, building payments processing tools and all sorts of stuff like that. Ended up like kind of then doing a brief stint in corporate VC with BBVA, which is a big Spanish bank, and help them kind of incubate a couple of fintech companies in-house, and then basically then went and was the first product person at Rippling, helped them kind of stand up the product and product marketing teams, working kind of like adjacent to fintech, kind of more on payroll software, and then left there to go start a company. And so originally actually started there was a whole different space, like AI product management platform, where we're helping teams to, kind of automate the research process around new products and features that they were launching. But through the course of that, we were actually building, AI agents, like before the word AI agents was really even a thing. And, we were kind of like building like complex workflows and like, how do you actually like run AI-based processes where you need to like manage, large unstructured documentation, at scale, and like do, extract like reliable, accurate information out of that. And so we were building all that, and kind of like midway through last year, we started realizing that we had built this like very, very powerful, orchestration framework that was used to like automate these processes, and that we were using to build our own workflows. And we kind of decided to like start kind of exposing it to folks as its own standalone thing, and ended up just becoming really clear there was like a much bigger there as a tool to help people kind of build their own agentic automations. And so that's kind of what became Double O, as we realized this was just a much more interesting space to be in. And so now what we're doing is like allowing anybody to take a existing process and convert that into an agentic process, which allows for a lot more kind of like flexible, kind of unstructured workflow, but do so with really, really high degrees of accuracy and reliability. So we're able to tackle, things that require like high data fidelity, but, also require like kind of handling of novel information and scenarios.
Very cool. Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. Obviously, agentic, agents. Maybe we start with kind of defining what that is, because it seems like certain people have used that term loosely, shall we say, and maybe they're doing is not really an AI agent or agentic process. So maybe if you can kind of define that for our audience, that'd be great.
Yeah, totally. I think like the word agent gets used in a lot of different paradigms right now, and none of them are necessarily wrong. So like, a lot of people think of it when they hear the word agent, they think about like chat-based experiences, because that's what a lot of the like big tech companies are pushing right now as their concept of agents. So you have like Salesforce pushing Agentforce, which is really just like creating a chat experience that can, use some tools to take some actions. You also have like the ChatGPTs of the world. You have, a bunch of these different experiences. Then you have like people that are talking about agents at the code level, and it's much more specific, kind of like input outputs type of using LLMs to like take some data and transform it based off an input, and then create some other kind of like structured output. The way that I always define this stuff is just, an agent is ultimately about using kind of an LLM as a brain and taking non-deterministic action using an array of possible like tools or actions that agent can take. And so usually like, that can exist in a workflow, that can exist in a chat, but what it is you're intaking some unstructured data and then giving it to an LLM that's able to decide what to do from like an array of possible things that it can do. And then it's able to use function calls, which, is usually basically just like the equivalent of like an integration to go and take action in those tools. So it's like not just kind of retrieving information in the way that ChatGPT does, but it's actually like doing things on your behalf in the tools that you're using.
Okay, so you said LLM, meaning large language model, and there's many of them out there. Which ones kind of just you can use different ones, like ChatGPT or OpenAI being one, right?
Yep.
What are the ones you guys are using or utilizing in your process?
Yeah, so we use all of them. So, we're model agnostic, so we can choose. You can actually even mix and match in a specific workflow, like which models you're using for different steps, depending on your preferences. But generally, like our base model tends to be Google Gemini, actually, but we also use OpenAI's GPT models as well. Generally, like I would say, the model itself, in most cases, like doesn't actually change the behavior of your agentic workflow too much. Like it's more just preference of like how they write more so than anything.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And you kind of touched on a couple of things early on about like reliability, making sure it's very reliable. How do you think about that? What does that process look like?
Yeah, so I think like this is a really interesting area where when you see kind of like adoption of AI in most companies, like one of the biggest limiting factors for it is that most companies, they are still like in the experimentation phase with AI, and they're not quite sure like how to structure and build workflow and tools around this stuff in order to ensure that like the AI is accurate, right? And so you end up with like large language models. They have a general problem of like they will hallucinate answers if they don't have the information to answer a question. They will oftentimes like malform the output in a way that like doesn't give you the exact data that they had as input. So it's really hard to like ensure that they actually give you the exact right answer and that they really reflect any data that they've retrieved accurately, which like obviously is super important, especially when you talk about like financial workflows where you need to be really really on point with like the specific data that's getting reflected in the output. And so there's a lot of, but the reality is like everybody assumes that like they're going to hallucinate and that's just what models do. And there's no solutions for that. That's not really actually the case. Like you can ensure that models have high degrees of accuracy. Like we are running workflows where we're getting to like 99% plus accuracy rates on very, very complex, reconciliation workflows. And that stuff, like the way that you do it is by building a bunch of scaffolding around the way that the model actually behaves. So, like what we've done is we've built into our workflows. If you think about our workflows like a series of steps, every step in the process actually has like a quote unquote like manager agent that is gut checking the work. So like you have kind of like the concept of like the step has a worker agent that's going to go do the work itself. And that agent's going to go use some tools to go get some data or create some data or take some action. And then the manager agent is basically going to gut check. Did that thing do the right stuff? And did it, like, if it found any data, like, did it reflect the data accurately in its output before it moves on to the next step? And if it doesn't, find accurate results, it ends up kind of like telling it to go redo this or change the approach in order to get the right actual accurate result. And so you can actually ensure like a really high degree of reliability on this stuff when you have the right structure and scaffolding around it. It's just that, I think the big issue is like most tools today that people are familiar with when they're playing around with AI do not do this. And so, they end up kind of like immediately losing trust, and it becomes really hard to like drive adoption for this stuff internally because, you get it wrong like one or two times and people immediately just discard it and say, hey, this doesn't work. Like it's not possible to get this to run reliably, but it really is.
Yeah. Well, that's going to be another question too. We can get into adoption as well, but why do most agentic tools fail? Obviously this is one reason, but any other kind of thoughts as to why the reliability tends not to be there at this point?
Yeah, I think like most people are making like a trade-off. So you in order to get to high degrees of reliability, like, usually what the classic approach is you break a problem into much smaller tasks, right? And you say like, okay, this like agent is not one big super agent that's going to be asked to do this whole workflow end to end. It's like a series of specialized sub agents that each have like much more granular tasks and they're able to do each of those individual things really, really accurately and with high reliability. So like in order to solve for the reliability problem, what people end up doing is, breaking this into really granular process, which then just becomes like really hard to build and maintain. It just becomes kind of like onerous and painful to set up your workflow to like, because you have to give really granular instruction at every step in the workflow of exactly what's going to happen and like exactly what actions the agents are going to take. It just, you end up having like this trade-off where it's like, you're either suffering from like, oh, I don't trust this thing because it can't run reliably, or, oh, this is like too much work. And it's like not even worth me automating because like, it's so much work for me to just get it to run reliably that I don't want to do it.
Yeah, definitely. That's actually brings up some good points there. Just get into more of the automation, talking about adoption. Maybe like who are you talking to? Who's your main audience as we kind of get into this? Who you guys are speaking with, and maybe you can talk about just the adoption framework, how that's happening. It seems to be kind of a hard sell these days for many different reasons, whether it be people aren't into tech. Maybe it goes to a tech conversation. Just the skill level is not there. I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's like learning this stuff on the fly, right? Like this is all new technology, and like the concept of like agents as a specific subset of like AI technology has really only existed for 10, 12 months. Like it's pretty new. So everybody's all learning this, as they go. And like, I think the skills are developing and people are starting to get more familiar with like proper prompting techniques and whatnot when they're building this stuff themselves. We try and take all of that off people's plate. So like we've built our platform in a way where like, you don't need to know prompting best practices. You don't really need to understand like how AI is going to work in general. You just kind of like describe a process and we build it out for you automatically. But we tend to work with like, so we have a range of clients. We are very horizontal, so we tackle use cases kind of across the whole spectrum of businesses. But I think, like we're working with a lot of, financial firms where we're doing kind of like invoice reconciliation against, both POs and, transactions. We're also doing a lot of workflows around, like procurement teams and helping them to, for example, like do vendor risk assessments and research. We're also helping them to do things like, for example, like reporting. So there's a lot of reporting use cases where you're kind of bubbling up like supply chain risks, for example, to those procurement teams. And then there's a lot of like also like sales and marketing use cases too that we tackle, but we tend to basically deal with like, some form of operations team in most of the companies that we're working with. So that could be, in a healthcare company, it could be a clinical ops team, and a marketing team, it could be a marketing ops team, and, a financial team, it might be, like procurement ops or, the FinOps team. So I think, it's usually some kind of like non-technical operations team that is kind of like the ones maintaining the process itself today. And then, we just kind of come in and help them like agentify that process.
Interesting. What were some interesting, or popular use cases that you're getting on your side from the workflow? Yeah.
Well, so like I mentioned, I think, like one of the most interesting is, like these very heavy, like data operations type of processes. So like reconciliation is a great one. We're doing a lot of workflows around, like intaking, transactions, like lists of transactions that happen every month, and then, kind of mapping those against invoices or GL codes or POs, and helping to kind of like just do three-way matching against all the different, transactions that are happening inside of a company, and then, pushing that into accounting systems or pushing that into, wherever it needs to go. So that's a really common one. I think, we're doing a lot of, like I mentioned, on the procurement side, like a lot of like vendor sourcing type of workflows where that's a combination of like doing risk assessments on the vendors and like researching them in depth, like every time a vendor is found, but also helping to actually like engage back and forth with them and like collect information about the vendor as part of that vendor risk assessment or as part of the sourcing process. So our agents are actually able to not just like process data, they can also do things like, communicate back and forth with people. So they can actually like create a, request for information to understand, the details around a vendor. They can go email that request for information to the vendor, intake back the results, and then even pass it through like an assessment process based on the vendor criteria that you're looking at, and say, hey, like this vendor replied to these questions with XYZ info, and that meets or doesn't meet the criteria that we have for a vendor for this specific project. And so, we're doing a lot of stuff around that. But again, like I think a lot of the bread and butter use cases end up being like very much like data processing, data administration type of workflows like that.
Yeah, I'm assuming, as you go through and have a conversation with various firms that you speak with, it's got to make an impact, whether it be financially to their bottom line or a scale play. I'm assuming you're trying to solve a actual problem that, because that comes up too, is like, does this even, I think you mentioned this earlier, is this even a problem worth solving in certain cases, right? If it's too much of a crazy workflow process, does it actually move the needle enough for the business to warrant, moving forward with it, right? And you mentioned, obviously, ChatGPT has been around for a short amount of time. Is it training us on the wrong things? Like just things, how it comes through the process. We go back and forth in this chat function, which is very limited, but this was kind of this is what started this whole journey for many of us last couple of years here. So I'm just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I have strong opinions about kind of how all the like chat-based experiences are like teaching us how AI works. And I think there's a lot of things that they're doing to basically help people like more easily like adopt the concept of AI, which are good generally for the industry, but are not necessarily good for people's understanding of like, how do I best construct a workflow like really solves problems for my business? So the classic example that I always use is like, everybody's assumption when they use AI is like, we really want to teach it stuff about our business and like have our business context kind of loaded into this so that it can like understand more about us and give more tailored results, whether that's like better workflow outputs or whether that's, just like creating information around your company. And so like the way that ChatGPT does this is like you can load infinite numbers of files into ChatGPT, right? And it there is like, hey, build your knowledge base about yourself or your company. And everybody assumes that it will use all of that knowledge anytime it's like doing something. The reality is it doesn't do that. What it does is it like takes small chunks of it, and like you're getting, anytime it's like conducting an operation, it's like searching for information specific to whatever that task at hand is, and then it's pulling out like little bits and pieces from that info, which is not actually giving a comprehensive understanding of your business. And like everybody's assumption is like, this thing's going to understand my business because I've loaded in all this information, but that's not what's happening. It's basically doing like very specific search for very specific pieces of info. And so, like there's ways around constructing knowledge bases that will be used in the way that like people assume, where, it will actually use broader context to understand a topic instead of searching and retrieving specific information. But like that's not the way that like most tools behave, and you have to like do very specific workflow construction in order to do that effectively, and there's a bunch of like technical reasons for that. But like, basically like ChatGPT has trained us that like, oh, we just like dump information into this and then it will be able to use all of it and it's going to understand me. But that's not how the actual AI works. And so I think, in our case, like we have to like untrain people on a lot of the concepts, around like, how do I best prompt things? How do I like treat knowledge? How do I do this stuff in workflow construction and agentic behavior, which is totally different from like how chat itself works in ChatGPT, because they're trying to ultra simplify the experience for, kind of like consumers.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely interesting. It kind of brings up a few, what you want to call it, mythbusters or whatnot, what people think it can and can't do. Is it like one big one is like, is it learning? We had more data to it. Is it actually learning? What's your thoughts on that? I mean, that's another one that gets quite a bit.
That's the other one. I mean, we are guilty of this too. Like we pitch that like, our workflows like learn over time. They do in a way, but like, the reality is like every single AI company out there, like they're pitching this concept of like, learning AI, that, it's either the model's going to learn or the workflow itself is going to learn and the agents are going to get better over time. The reality is like the way that large language models work, they do not learn. There is no concept of like training a large language model unless you are literally building the foundation model itself. So OpenAI can teach a model, but it's not going to like iteratively learn, right? What it's going to do is it's going to, each time a new model gets released, that model is trained on some set of information. And that model is like a point in time of like learning. And so you can like fine tune these things. So you can add like tuning, but the problem is like fine tuning comes with a lot of problems, and it actually creates more problems than it solves because you end up overtraining the model. So you can have a model like gradually like learn and iterate via fine tuning, but you actually shouldn't in most cases because it's like actually dangerous to like the reliability of your workflow because it's going to start like creating the same output for a different problem. And so I think like, you know, like I would generally just like from a myth busting perspective, like be skeptical of anybody who claims that their like AI is learning over time, unless they're like, they can explicitly explain to you the way that it's storing information over time and then going and retrieving different sets of information to pass, you know, information into the processor workflow that's doing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, because that gets brought up too with data, right? So everybody sits on, especially in finance and asset management, as we all know, there's tons of data, private data sets people are sitting on internally. They want to utilize that for their knowledge base. How do they get that data into a framework that makes sense? And then on top of it, how do they keep it compliant and secure? And the data age, everybody's getting, you know, data breaches are happening all the time. So what are your thoughts on that? Just how, I mean, there's a couple of different ways to deploy AI into an organization, whether it be using a tool or a system or doing it on-prem internally. Kind of break that down for us a bit.
Yeah, so I think it's funny. I was at a analyst conference a couple of weeks ago, and you know, like there was some thought leader that was up there, and he was basically explaining like the concept of like everybody's concerned about their data training models, and like, you know, the reality is like that's what he said, and you know, I agree with, is that is already a solved problem. It's not something people need to worry about anymore. Like it is, you know, all of the enterprise large language model agreements, like all contain provisions that they are not going to train any models with your data. Like it is all getting trained on the broader internet and their own synthetic data. It's not getting trained on like customer usage data. So there's very little risk that like if you're using a commercial model, it's actually going to be trained on your data or risk being surfacing your data like in an output for a different company. I think there was a lot of like fear around that early on in large language models, which was justified in like, you know, the very, very early versions of this, but that's kind of gone away now. But you know, in the absence of that, like if that is still a concern, there's a lot of ways that you can kind of like add additional layers of security here. So one is, you know, like you said, you can do private cloud deployments. You can do on-prem deployments where you take a model and you kind of like create a private instance of that, which is containerized to just your company. That is like the most secure way of doing this. And like nothing's ever going to pass outwards in that scenario. Alternately, you can also do like data masking. So there's methods where you can have, you know, basically your data get tokenized, and then the model sees like a token and doesn't actually see the data itself, and then is going to, you know, run the analysis or whatever you're doing, you know, that way. So there's a couple of ways around it, but like I think generally like I have this conversation with customers all day long, and I really think it's like much less of a concern than everybody is making it out to be. And that's just because, you know, everybody's kind of like still kind of a year behind on like where the state of the art on security for the models is today.
Yeah. Well, I think to the point earlier, it's just that the AI knowledge of what it actually can and can't do is not everybody's been kind of brought up to speed, if you will, like you said. So people are still, the first thing is like, hey, it's going to take my job. That's the first thing that people talk about. Now it's going to do this. What can and can't it do? You know, is it, you know, all the fear comes out first initially, and then center thought processes prevail usually. But
the right questions to be asking too. It's like these are the right questions that people should be asking. It's just, you know, I think like there's not great information out there around what is the actual reality of like how the models are going to work. And part of it's like they're also kind of a black box to some degree too. So people are like, well, we can't directly explain exactly how they work, so we don't know if we can trust them.
Right. So I guess going through, Derek, kind of just back and forth with software across different tools and systems. What are your thoughts about that process? I mean, it was a little chaotic to start, I would say, but people are having more integrations now and more API-driven activity. What are your thoughts on how that all works?
For sure. So I think there's a couple of different like paradigms for how agents can like take action in a tool, right? So the two main ones that like everybody is not like there's not clear differentiation on like what tools are using which version of this, but like basically there's you can either do this, take these actions via API and like giving the agents like direct capability to like take action directly in the tool via the integrations that they have or via an external API or via like embedded like native tools. And I'll come back to this one. Then the other option is you are having the agent actually like operate a browser or operate your computer. And what happened, like I'll just kind of explain how both of those work. Like, right. So like when you're operating an API, the agent is basically constructing the API call and it passes data into it, like in the format that that API needs. And then it says, hey, I'm going to go do this thing. And it's based on a structured input output that's like defined by the tool that you're interacting with. That's super, super high reliability. It's always going to work. And it's always going to work in exactly the way that like is defined in that API. And like, so this is like what I recommend most tools do. And so like, this is how we do, all of our kind of actions in the tools that we're working with Double O. The other option is like, if you're using a browser or you're using, your computer, what the agent does is like, it basically opens a browser instance and then the LLM kind of looks at every page. So like what happens is like the LLM looks at the page, it sees like, here's the HTML for that page. And then it says, okay, there's all these different like objects on that page. Based on the task or the goal that I've been given, I'm going to go click on this task or this object on that page. And then it says, okay, I'm going to like click that. And then it goes and clicks it. And then it repeats the thing on every page until it gets to whatever the like final action that it was given is. And the big problem with that approach, so like that is like being pitched right now as sort of the state of the art. It's very, 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 very unreliable right now. It is incredibly hard to get that process to work consistently 100% of the time in 100% of the same instances. And the big reason is because you're just like going back to one of the things that I mentioned at the very, very beginning of the show is like you're deferring too much action to the LLM without any like governance in place. There's no like concept of like a supervisor gut checking like each of those different actions that happens. And so it's very hard for you to like ensure that the LLM is going to do the thing that you want it to do, because it could say, if it lands on a page that has, a button that's like learn more versus, like let's say get a demo, like learn more and get a demo are kind of conceptually the same thing, but you're going to end up on very, very different paths on a website, depending on which one you click. One might like sign you up for an email list. One might, actually go and like book a demo. And if the goal of the agent is to get a demo or to, like, let's say, research the product, like both of those are actually good paths for it to take. And you can't determine like which path it should actually go down. So the hard thing is, like generally, like if you do the browser stuff, you're not going to be able to create consistent execution. It's a lot of the same problems that like traditional RPA had, right? Like RPA has suffered from this for a long time, which is you have pretty brittle workflows that are like kind of unreliable as websites are changing and as, products are changing. So I generally recommend like, use APIs for this stuff. And you're able to do all of this with like very, very high degrees of accuracy, and you can still do all the same actions. Like we can go operate websites, via APIs. It's just a matter of like constructing the right integrations.
Yeah, definitely. Robotic process automation, right? RPA, as you mentioned, is I think people now are trying to embed AI into RPA, because RPA was a process and operations that I dealt with that you need a lot of maintenance. If one field is off, the whole thing doesn't work, right? There's a lot of stuff, to your point, it was always problematic from my experience as well. One thing you said, Derek, which I thought was interesting earlier, was about horizontal versus maybe vertical software, specialized versus maybe more flexible software. Everybody has an opinion on, what should we, focus more on niche industry specific AI versus flexible horizontal AI solutions. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I think like AI has introduced this big difference from like the way that software traditionally has worked. Like it used to be that you could not build a tool horizontally that could do a great job at every single possible use case in every single possible industry. You needed like specialized domain expertise in order to make sure that it like did the thing correctly. And part of that was like you needed to build specialized integrations. Part of it was you need to like build specialized logic for how I was going to kind of navigate through those things. And like the big difference with like AI is you actually can, as long as you have the domain expertise somewhere in the process, you can actually build horizontal tools that like functionally allow people to kind of like custom build their own workflow or products that are directly tailored not just to their industry, but to them, to their specific process. And I think like my general take is that like AI is a world where specialized vertical tools, they're going to feel more accessible because they're going to speak the same language like in the industry that you're in or in the like product space that you're in. But the reality is like they're not necessarily actually going to deliver better results by any means, because under the hood, what's going on with them is almost identical to what's happening if you're using like a horizontal tool that kind of is like built around a broader, like flexible set of use cases like Double O is. And I think the big difference is just, you know, in our case, like we convert your existing process into the process automation. So like, you know, we don't need specialized domain expertise to do a really good job of this. We did this with medical coding. We popped into like, you know, healthcare companies that none of us on our team had any experience working with medical coding before. And we have done a better job than their existing medical coding tools and platforms, you know, just by going in and having them, you know, articulate like, hey, how do you do this today? We'll build that and build it custom. So I think like my take is, you know, if you're going to use AI generally, and if you're going to use agents, the whole value to them is how much they can closely map to your process, and they can be flexible and conform and adapt to like different structures to process and use shared like knowledge and context about the company in order to do that. And if you start using like a bunch of vertical tools, you create these like data and workflow silos where you end up with kind of a lot of the same problem that you had with SaaS, where, you know, they don't talk to each other well, right? And so like, you know, with horizontal tools, with agents, you can build your own custom workflows and then extend those workflows into like a whole system that works kind of cross-functionally across all the different processes that you have inside the company. And it works really, really elegantly and nicely, which wasn't possible with SaaS. So I'm a big like believer in like horizontal tools with agents specifically, just because like it's a totally different paradigm for like how you actually build process and workflow.
Yeah, that's really interesting. By the way, for Double O, and we'll get into specifically what you guys are working on a few different facets there. Where did the name come from?
Just a little play on James Bond. I mean, we're you know, we were like, we're in agents, you know, we might as well have some fun with it.
Yeah, I like it. That's awesome. That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's great. So I guess getting to Double O kind of platform, you know, what you guys are doing. What's the easiest way for people to start with agents? You know, because I can see there's a lot to it, like for a lot of folks. Maybe you kind of distill it down to how people can start from a framework there.
Yeah. So, I mean, like selfishly, you know, like I think personally, I feel like Double O is one of the easiest ways for people to like get started with this stuff, because, you know, you can basically just come in and, you know, the starting point is you define your process. You just document like, if I were a human, what would I do? Like, what are the steps that I would follow? And you don't have to do that in a lot of detail, just very high level. It's like, you know, for example, like I always use like a prepping for all my meetings for today, you know, example is like, if I want to build a workflow to do that in Double O, I would just say, okay, every morning, check my calendar, research everybody I'm meeting with by looking at their LinkedIn, looking at their CRM, and then email me some pre-call sales notes. That's the level of definition you need around like your process. And then you just dump it into Double O and it kind of builds out the workflow. But like we are very high touch with this. So, you know, generally if you're trying to get started, like we would suggest, you know, reach out to us. We'll help you kind of like build out that first workflow, and, you know, we'll get you successful without you really needing to do anything other than tell us kind of how do you do the process today. So I think, you know, like there's a lot, I would generally suggest like if the one step before that though is if you have not, you know, played extensively with ChatGPT, with, you know, like just the models themselves and understood kind of like how they think, because they are also sort of like slightly foreign brains, right? Like, you know, just start familiarizing yourself with ChatGPT, go play around with it, you know, see like what's possible broadly and just like how it kind of responds and how it like manages knowledge, and then start thinking about like, okay, like now how do I take my process and go dump that into a tool like Double O and start to automate it.
Very cool. Yeah. And you brought up an interesting point from a prompting perspective. That's always, there's a lot of things about prompting out there. And you're like this, you don't really need to know that. You just need to tell it what to
Yeah.
do from an English perspective. And speak English.
Yeah.
You can, you can type in what you want to do. It'll follow the directions.
I always tell people it's like, treat it like a really smart intern that like, has no experience and has no resources available to them either. So like, that's the other thing is you need to give it like enough instruction that, it's not an intern where it can go ask people inside the company for additional info or like, where to find info inside of tools. So just tell it like, if you needed to give this intern instruction on how to do this process without, human support, how would you tell them to do it? And if you can do that, like, and just, natural plain English, you can automate it. Like, and there is almost zero process that we have run into where it is not automatable using agents, as long as it's not like, involving like offline activity, like, people meeting in person.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. On the kind of maybe the use cases for marketing and finance teams, so what are you seeing there from a use case perspective? What are people building or trying to build from a workflow perspective?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think like on the marketing front, and we see a bunch of this in finance, in various flavors of finance as well. So we see a lot of like kind of deep research type of workflows that are using kind of like structured, repeatable processes for doing specific research. Obviously, like ChatGPT has its concept of like deep research built into it, but when you're talking about like, for example, researching vendors, for example, or doing compliance assessments for, like, does this company have specific certifications or does this company have specific, like processes in place, and like, do they have a security page on their website, for example? Like, you want to be able to define specifically the places that it's going to go research. So you have high degrees of confidence that you're going to go get accurate information that's relevant to your use case. So I think like we see a lot of workflows where people are building kind of like custom, hey, go like do a compliance check on this company by searching this database for whether or not they have, XYZ certification. Go do continuous monitoring on like, does their geography have sanctions in place around it that, we need to be, conscious of this vendor is like suddenly a risk because there's been new sanctions imposed. So we see a lot of like kind of those kind of competitive intel and or like vendor research type workflows. I think on the like we were talking about earlier, I think on the finance side, there's a ton of like reconciliation, accounts payable, like chasing workflows. So, going and like running reports on all of the vendors who, have outstanding payments and then going chasing them on a monthly, weekly, daily basis. I think there's a lot of like basic reporting workflows where, we're analyzing whether that's data pulled out of like an accounting system or it's data pulled out of like a variety of Excel sheets that are living in Google Drive, kind of extracting that information and bubbling up like specific custom information that is important for reporting. So like we're doing, for example, like, board prep for a lot of teams where, we go and like look at a variety of different data points, whether that's like, things that are retrieved via API and their marketing analytics tools, whether that's, like financial models that are being pulled from an Excel doc. And we aggregate all of that and like create kind of board deck content. And so we're doing like monthly board prep for folks. So there's a whole mess of use cases, but it's a lot of like, kind of like moving data from one place to another, taking action, like updating tools with information.
Yeah, there's a lot of different nuances there. Still a lot of spreadsheets out there, right? That people are trying to pull data from.
Yep.
So one thought, Derek, regarding some of these other tools like Zapier, Make, N8N, as workflow automation tools that are out there. What are your thoughts on those? Is that more old school processing? Are they adaptable and flexible? What are your kind of thoughts on those different frameworks that are out there?
Yeah, it's a super good question. So I think like this is where, I think getting back into the like trade-off of like reliability versus like, complexity of building and maintaining, right? Like those tools, they're pitching the concept of like agents, but the reality is like they all started as workflow automation pre-AI, pre-agentic automation. And so what they've at the end of the day is they're data connectors. So they're, usually like every step in a process for them is like a very prescriptive specific action that requires a lot of like configuration on the user's end. So like I have people show me workflows they built out in like N8N or in Make, and there's like literally like 100 steps through this process to accomplish a process that like, in Double O you can do in like 2 steps and, just a little bit of like natural language instruction. And so I think the big difference is just, these tools are great. I love all of those tools. And I think like that was kind of how they were a lot of original inspiration for what we built with Double O. But the big thing to keep in mind is like, they are not agents, right? Like they're not agentic tools. They can't flexibly take action from an array of different possible tools or functions that they need to access. And so you have to really granularly prescribe everything that's going to happen inside of a workflow. So it just becomes like very onerous to build and maintain, which, I think like generally that's how we kind of position against those. They're great tools, but like if you want to build a process that you as a non-developer can like easily and quickly build out and maintain, like you're not going to have a good time if you go use those. And you can build similar workflows. It's just there's a lot less flexibility to it, and there's a lot like higher degree of like maintenance effort required for them.
Yeah. Would you describe it like almost like an RPA process, RPA-esque, shall we say, those types of tools?
They're definitely much closer to RPA, where like, again, like you have to like, again, define every single thing that's going to happen in the process in order for it to happen in the way that you expect, versus in our case, like you define the more higher level goals at each step in the process. And then, they'll non-deterministically like handle different errors and different like novel situations.
Got it. Okay. One last question I wanted to bring up. We talked about adoption earlier. Where do you see that adoption process starting? I mean, I always get asked that question too. Like, okay, is it the C-suite? Is it the founder and a CTO? Where does someone start that kind of transformational process?
Yeah, it does vary a bit. Like, I think company to company, I think, like AI is very much this like weird beast right now where it's like, you kind of usually have like some champion inside the company that's like excited about AI. And that person could be like a C-level exec. That person could be like a brand new intern that just joined. And so I generally suggest like, starting with somebody who's just like enthusiastic and motivated around, like figuring out AI and is willing to kind of like work through a little bit of like complexity around that. But I do think like generally when I see companies driving like real initiatives around AI broadly, it is like much more coming from top down than bottom up these days. I think you're seeing a lot more kind of like executive teams looking for like, how do we build like real efficiency into the business, because they have just a broader perspective on like where kind of headcount costs are lying. They can see kind of like how costs are contributing from one area to another. And so I think like I'm seeing a lot of like top down initiatives, but you still need somebody who's going to like be boots on the ground, like, managing and building the process. And so, whether that's like an external organization, like, us in this case, or, it's like an operations person internally who's going to build these workflows themselves, you still need somebody to implement it, which oftentimes, is not going to be that exec that's like sponsoring the process.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Well, this has been great, Derek. This is great conversation. A lot of different aspects we covered here. We appreciate you taking the time today. Where can someone reach out and find out more about Double O and yourself?
Yeah. So our website's doubleO.ai, spelled the word double and then the letter O.ai. And then if you want to reach out on LinkedIn, like I'm on LinkedIn, it's linkedin.com, Derek Osgood 3 on there. And, I'm pretty active there. So if you want to reach out, shoot us a note.
Amazing. Well, this has been great. And we'll make sure to include all the contact info in the show notes as well.